Well, that's impressive. I didn't even have to ask you to quieten down. And we're going to start on time. So welcome everybody to the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Bob Ward. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and the ESRC Centre for Climate Change, Economics and Policy. As you can tell, we don't go in for short names here at LSE. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here for our special lunchtime seminar by our very special guest lecturer. Before I introduce her, I'm going to just outline the format for the event and some housekeeping. So the first housekeeping point, as you would expect, is there are no fire drills planned for the next 1.5 hours. So if you hear a fire alarm, please exit to the nearest fire door. You will see them marked appropriately. We have an hour and a half, more or less. We're going to finish at 2 o'clock. Our guest speaker is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have Q&A for 45 minutes, and we're going to try a bit of innovation where you're going to be asked to use your phones, if you can, to submit questions. So those of you who have phones with you might be prepared to do that. We'll also take questions from the floor from people who don't have phones or whose phones can't get reception down here in the bowels of the new academic building. We're very lucky today to have Katharine Hayhoe here to speak on a very short tour she's doing of the UK at the moment. Katharine is an atmospheric scientist, for those of you who don't know, and her research focuses on understanding what climate change means for people and the places where they live. She's a professor at Texas Tech University, And those of you who may have seen her presenting her series of broadcasts, PBS digital broadcasts, Global Weirding. If you haven't seen them yet, I highly recommend you go to YouTube and track them down. They're really excellent. She's a remarkable communicator, not just as a climate scientist, but I think amongst the most effective communicators about climate change around in the whole world at the moment. Her skills have been recognized through numerous prizes, including the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize and the Steve Schneider Climate Communication Award. She's been named on lots of lists of influential and important people, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People and Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers and Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Leaders. So, today Katharine's going to speak to us about changing the climate dialogue. It's going to be a fascinating lecture. I'm sure you'll all enjoy it. And please join me in welcoming Katharine to the stage.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. The first thing I learned from any of those lists that Bob went through is that you should read your mail more carefully before you delete it. The first time I ever got one of those emails, I thought it was spam. It went to the junk folder. And it wasn't until I received 3 or 4 more asking me if I was coming to a dinner that I thought it might be something different. So we are going to be interactive today. If you have a laptop with you, you can use your laptop. If you don't, use your phone. And go to polev.com. Those are double L's, polev.com/Texas Tech. That's my university. It will ask you for a name, but you don't have to enter a name. You can just skip that part. It is 100% anonymous. There is no personal information being collected. So polev.com/Texas Tech. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first question. Are you an undergraduate student, a graduate student, a community member, or faculty and staff? And I would note that an undergrad student was the first person to respond to the poll. That tells you something. All right, so it looks like we got about 40% graduate students holding steady, a fair amount of community members, and then, faculty and staff is pulling ahead there. Oh, okay. It's a close race. It's a close race for second. All right, it looks like, the community members are pulling ahead. All right, it looks like we're about a third. I know. You can't see on the screen how many respondents there are, but when you actually look at the program, it tells you how many respondents. Okay, the community members are pulling slightly ahead. Graduate students and faculty and staff are equally balanced. All right, so now you know how this works. So when it comes to talking about climate change, about politics, about immigration, about elections, about almost anything, it seems like this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes that was written a number of years ago is almost eerily prescient now. We live in interesting times where we don't trust the government, we don't trust the legal system, we don't trust the media, and we don't trust each other. We've undermined all authority, and with it, the basis for replacing it. Hobbes, always the voice of reason, says interesting is a mild way of putting it. And Calvin says it's a 6-year-old's dream come true. We know that the conflict between science and decision-making goes back years, and it isn't everything to do with climate change, it's on a whole range of issues. In fact, this book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, was written by the man who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1964, and he published this book the year after. When you look for things that people have said about anti-intellectualism, you come up with quotes from 1954 on how unreason abominates thought because thinking implies disagreement. Disagreement implies nonconformity. Nonconformity implies heresy. And heresy implies disloyalty, so obviously thinking must be stopped. But shouting is not a substitute for thinking, and reason is not subversion, but the salvation of freedom. Does this not seem like prophecy today? Isaac Asimov, a famous writer of science fiction, in 1980 wrote about a cult of ignorance in the United States, he specifically said, but I think we can speak to that in other places as well. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. And as climate scientists, we encounter this every day on social media. Somebody who says, well, I know better than you because I read a blog. Or, in the words of one of many Facebook comments, this comment actually came from a student, an undergraduate student at my institution. The type of arrogance, writing on my page, is exactly what I would expect from someone who is trying so desperately to defend their climate change religion. But alas, I will try to educate you. The conversations that happen are fraught with lack of civility, with argument, with body language that looks like this. I know, you didn't expect this to be illustrated by Calvin and Hobbes. It's not really, these are the only two, but I think that they're very relevant. When we just, talking about climate science, for example, what happens? Susie the scientist shows up with all of her scientific reports. If you piled all the scientific reports up to the ceiling, you could do that probably with IPCC reports alone, let alone getting into regional assessments, National Academy reports, Royal Society reports. And what does Calvin respond with? Calvin does not respond with his own stack of data and facts. Calvin responds with his identity, who he is. And so that's why conversations like this, rather than building bridges, they tend to dig trenches, ending something like this, or perhaps like this. So let me ask you, and now you have to answer with a word. If you need to use 2 or 3 words, please join them with a dot or a space, or not a dot or a dash. Don't leave a space, okay? No spaces. What topic is so politically polarized that we can hardly have, yes, exactly, that we can hardly have a good conversation about it anymore? If you're going to use 2 words, remember to join them with something. Don't leave a space. Yes, population, climate change, vaccine, immigration, people from other races or religious traditions, flying. That's a huge one. Yes. Abortion, taxation, Palestine, gender politics, GMOs, veganism. Yes. This is a really long list of things we can't talk about. I mean, the weather is even more important now. It seems like that's, well, no, actually, we can't talk about the weather either. There are a lot of things that it's really difficult to have conversations with people about. And a big part of that is because when you look at what's been happening to us politically over the last few years, I hate to go off this because it's so interesting. When you look at the political landscape, this is the political landscape in the United States where it's easy to graph it in 2 dimensions because there's just 2 parties. It's a little more complicated in other places. For example, in Canada, we have 5 parties. You'd have to have a few different axes here. But this, I think, really makes the point of something that we are seeing around the world today. So back in 1994, 25 years ago, the political landscape of the United States was very normally distributed. It was very centrist. The median Democrat was just a few points away from the median Republican. This is from the Pew Political Polarization Survey. And the distributions of Democrats and Republicans were both quite symmetrical. Most of the people were in the middle. What has happened over time? Well, jumping ahead to 2011, moving on to 2017, and then only surveying people who actually voted in the last presidential election, so people who are politically active. What happened here? 2 things happened. The biggest thing that happened was the shape of the distribution changed, so that now there are more people out at the edges than there are in the middle. And so what happened to the mean? The mean, of course, moved much farther apart. And here's the interesting thing that I've noticed, and you've probably noticed too. People over here think that they're in the middle and everybody else is over here. And then everybody over here thinks that they're actually the voice of common sense and reason in the middle, and all those other people are over here. And a matter of fact is, the polarization is happening in both directions, and it certainly is not happening only in the United States. If you just take a sample of headlines around the world, from Canada to the UK to Brazil, we see that this increase in tribalism, this increase in political polarization is growing around the world. So what does that have to do with climate change? Pretty much everything. So going back to 2014, so 2014, Obama was in power. He was moving ahead with the Clean Power Plan. When they surveyed voters in 2014, 5 years ago, and they said, what do you think of these different issues? And then they said, are you Democrat or Republican? And then they ranked the issues based on which ones were most politically polarized. In other words, which ones people most disagreed on, depending on who they voted for. So when you look at the list of most politically polarized issues in the US 5 years ago, not today, the first one on the list was, do you approve of the president? And that should be the most politically polarized one, right? I mean, that actually should be number one. That should be the one where people are most different depending on which party they vote for. But here's the rest of the list. This was in 2014. What's actually most scary for me is not number 2 on the list. What's most scary for me is number 4. I mean, do you trust your accountant? Do you trust your physician? How do you trust scientists somehow become a politically polarized issue? The work of Larry Hamilton, a sociologist at the University of New Hampshire, illustrates this in even more detail. He asked people, not do you trust scientists in general, but he said, do you specifically trust scientists on vaccines, climate change, nuclear power, evolution, and GMOs? And then he asked people, do you self-identify as liberal, moderate, moderate conservative, or conservative? And what we see is we see a gradient, right? So the whole trust in scientists is not generic across the spectrum. It depends on the issues. And what are the biggest issues? The biggest issue is, number 1, climate change, which goes from 89% of people saying they do if they're liberal to 34% if they're conservative. Then you've got evolution, 84% to 32%, and then you have GMOs, 73% to 31%. So the trust in scientists, or the lack of trust in scientists, depends critically on the issue. Because, just as an example, physicians are scientists too. If you had a very concerning illness and you went to a physician and they diagnosed you as having a certain disease, and then they checked with 10 of their colleagues and they all confirmed that you really do have this disease, most of us would trust that person's diagnosis. So it's a very selective rejection of science. And furthermore, it is deliberately fostered. It is not coming out of nowhere. It is being deliberately fostered in the United States. Some of the people who are deliberately fostering it are the very politicians. Now, just recently, he came around and said, okay, maybe it is real, but it's not bad. But that's just another scale on the denial scale. You have, it's not happening, it is, but it isn't humans, it is, but it's not bad, it is, but it would be too expensive to fix it. And then the last one on the list is, you really should have warned us earlier, now it's too late. And we see politicians cycle through this list and we feel encouraged as they move down the list, but we shouldn't be, because every single step is aimed at opposing climate action for a different excuse. From Texas, our representative talked about alarmist theories originate with scientists who operate outside the principles of the scientific method. And really, this man was the most honest. I believe climate change is largely leftist propaganda. It's aimed at changing the way Americans live and creating more government obstruction and intrusion into our lives. He hit the nail on the head. Because when you talk to people, and I've had thousands of these conversations, and many of you have had too, when you talk to people about climate change, or when they even bring up the topic, they will say to you something like this: it's just a natural cycle, and that carbon tax is a plan to destroy my retirement. Same sentence. The neurons in the brain are next door to each other. Those climate scientists are just making it up to line their pockets with government grants, and it'll destroy the economy anyways to fix it. It isn't rejection of science per se, it's rejection of the perceived solutions. But here's the thing, if I say it's a real problem but I don't want to fix it, that makes me the bad guy. We don't want to be the bad guy, we want to be the good person. The good person can be shrewd and savvy and say, oh, well, you know, there's some studies that say this and there's some studies that say that, so we don't know yet, we shouldn't move ahead. Or, the smart person might even say, hey, warmer is better. Haven't you looked at the greening of the planet? But a good person wouldn't say, sure, it's a real problem, but I don't want to fix it. So out of our need for self-justification, we make up these smoke screens of reasons why we can reject the science of climate change when the real reasons have nothing to do with the science. And I snapshotted the bios of 6 of the most recent accounts on Twitter who said nasty things to me. Not providing their names, keeping their anonymity. But what I wanted to highlight for you is, what do these bios have in common? And before, when anyone attacks me on social media, I look at their profiles, and in their threads, you see the same things coming back again and again, to where it is crystal clear that rejection of climate science, and by implication climate solutions, is only one piece of an entire package. It goes with the package. Now, these are from the US, but then I just updated that this morning with Canadian and UK bios. So here's a selection of Canadian and UK bios. It's really fascinating. So the CBC is basically like the BBC. They have the same rules regarding accuracy of reporting and facts as the BBC does, just for the record. There's a lot of support of US politics among people in the UK and in Canada, as well as elsewhere, who also embrace this worldview, which includes rejection of science. But when we hear arguments, we don't often hear them lead with these arguments. You know what we hear them lead with? And I apologize for these bios. I certainly did not write them, and I would never do so. Some of them are deeply offensive. But I'm telling you this because these are the people who say this. But they don't lead with that. They lead with other things. They lead with, it's just a natural cycle, or we haven't studied this long enough to be sure, or you scientists are making the whole thing up, or sea levels are lying. I actually heard that one. Talk about, humanizing sea level rise. Or, it's such a tiny amount of CO2, as if they would expect to go to the doctor and get an antibiotic that was this big. I mean, really, everybody knows that the size doesn't matter, it's the potency. Or, of course, our favorite between the months of November and April. I was actually half expecting an ice storm today, Bob. I mean, there's typically an ice storm when you're talking about climate change in April or May. And I did get a really big snowstorm in Wisconsin in April. So that does happen. So let me actually ask you, and here you can enter a full sentence if you want, what's a common objection that you hear? You can enter your own sentence, or please also upvote what other people put in so we can see what rises to the top. What is a common objection that you hear people saying when you talk about climate change? It can be anything. So you go ahead and enter your own, and also go ahead and upvote some other things too. All right. So far we have 4 votes for it's a natural cycle. I can't do anything as an individual. That is a huge one. It is enormous, especially in countries with smaller populations like Canada, like the UK, like Norway. We think, well, compared to China or the US, we're nothing. I mean, the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis today is China. The second is the US. The third is food waste, not a country. But if you actually put it in those terms. I can't do anything. It's natural cycle. Why bother? My response won't make a difference. It costs too much. That's actually got 8 votes. I'm going to combine those. It's too expensive. This is what we hear. And so what we often think is, And this is a little cartoon from our global weirding episode called exactly this. We think, well, if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? But assuming that facts will change people's minds is assuming that people's minds look like this. And I don't know about you, but I have a lot of writing on my personal slate already. By the time a child is just a few years old, they've got a ton of writing on their slate. From things they've picked up, from ways that they've decided the world works. Kids have the most amazing scientific brains, and they figure out why things work, right or wrong. And by the time we get to the point where we're having these conversations, we're not blank slates. We have a ton of information already written on our slates, and we are highly motivated not to erase it because we have ownership of that, and that is part of what forms our identity. So over the last 10 years, I think some of the greatest advances that have been made in the science of understanding climate change and our response have actually not been in the physical sciences, but rather in the social sciences. Specifically, understanding how we as humans react to information. A seminal study was done 6 years ago, published in Nature by Dan Kahan and colleagues. This is Dan. Where he examined the common myth that we academics also often fall into, which is if people don't understand it, we just need to write another report. This one maybe could have animated graphics. What if, wait for it, what if we did some video summaries? So we think people are apathetic because they don't know enough. So what's the answer? We need to give them more information. And this is why I love the social science. We conducted a study to test this. We found no support. In fact, people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned. They were actually most polarized about a changing climate. And in fact, in later data, Dan went on to develop a test of what he calls ordinary science intelligence, which measures quantitative reasoning. And he looked at people's ordinary science intelligence out to the 99th percentile and whether it increased their probability of giving the correct response to this statement. He found quite a weak correlation, not a very strong correlation at all. And then he took his sample and he separated it out by one thing. You can probably guess what that was. In fact, some work that Larry Hamilton did in New Hampshire, he looked at it slightly differently. He just looked at level of education, and he asked them, do you agree that climate change is happening now caused mainly by human activities? And as people's level of education increased, we became ever more divergent in our views. So we aren't blank slates, and treating ourselves like we are does not work. So how can we effectively talk about climate change in an environment like this? The first step is don't fall for the smoke screens. What are the smoke screens? The smoke screens are, first of all, the idea that people truly, genuinely have a fundamental problem with nonlinear fluid dynamics and radiative transfer. And that somehow by explaining basic physics and chemistry that we have understood since the 1800s or even earlier, we are able to convince them to declare a climate emergency. That is the first smokescreen. The second smokescreen is the idea, this is the first one here, the second smokescreen is one that you might not see as much here, though trust me, it does exist. I have samples. But it's one that you see a lot more in the US, much more than in any other country. It leaks across the border to Canada and to the UK as well, thanks to our interconnected media. The second smokescreen we hear is one that was expressed somewhat wordily by this Indiana politician. It's not settled scientists because those 97% of those liberal scientists who believe humans are doing this, so notice the words there, liberal, believe, they also believe there is no God. So scientists, like the rest of us humans, can have beliefs, but that doesn't make it science. In Texas, we're a lot more succinct. It's not science, it's a religion. So we often hear religiously sounding myths, and I hear them quite a bit. Bring on the end times. We have dominion over the earth to subdue it. In the Bible, it says there will always be seasons, so it can't be getting warmer because God is in control, not humans. Those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. So people often say, well, we have to fix people's religious beliefs because there's something fundamentally wrong with their religious beliefs that is causing them to reject the science. But the fascinating thing is that when you poll people and you ask them how concerned they are about a changing climate, it turns out the very least concerned people in the entire United States are white Catholics who edged out white evangelical Protestants by 1 percentage point. But if you include the lighter orange bar, then they actually fall behind. And then at the very top, who's the most concerned people group about a changing climate? Hispanic Catholics. And then you might say, but don't they have the same Pope? And did not that same Pope write an entire encyclical about how bad climate change was and how it connects directly to Christian values? Yes. So what happened when he wrote this encyclical? Well, thankfully, I actually have a colleague at my university who studies this. This is Ashley Landrum. And what she did was she studied the impact of the Pope's encyclical on people's opinions. And in a nutshell, what she found is that if people already agreed that climate was changing and humans were probably responsible, then they thought better of the Pope, if they were Protestant or Catholic. So people's opinion of the Pope went up. But if they didn't agree with the Pope, then when he published the encyclical, their opinion of the Pope went down. In fact, it could be best summed up by the phrase people use in Texas, bless his heart, which means he means well, but he has no clue what he's talking about. And then we found something else really interesting. So I've been a guinea pig the last few years. My dad is a science educator, and he teamed up with a couple of other people who do science education to take my videos and to show them at theologically conservative Christian colleges across North America, to do a pre-test and a post-test, and to look at what changed in people's opinions. So the first thing they did, and this is the whole reason why we did our Global Weirding series, we tested whether a video or an in-person talk affected people's opinions. And to my great joy, we found out that it had no significant difference. There was a significant difference before versus after, but between video and in person, there wasn't. So what happened was as the students came in, they were funneled into one of two rooms. One had a video of me and one had me actually presenting. But then what they did was they did something really interesting. They took out the Christian part of the message, and they only showed the sciencey part. And they showed that didn't make a difference. Why? Because the video was being presented by a trusted source. So whatever information was being presented by a trusted source, even if the content itself was not overtly, explicitly Christian, it actually had the same effect, which was amazing. Why is that? Well, John Evans, I think, has part of the answer. He said, it's true that conservative Protestants, and Catholics too now we know, are less likely to believe the conclusiveness of climate science, but when you control for demographic properties, it's not where and how they go to church that matters. It's the correlation between political conservatism. So the second smokescreen is the idea that there are fundamentally theological objections to climate change. And this is true if you look across the spectrum. If you look at all the tenets of faith of the major world religions, every single major world religion has something at the core of its faith, whether the people practice it or not, and we're all terrible at actually practicing what we say we believe. But there are core tenets of stewardship or care for nature, and there are core tenets of caring for people less fortunate than us. And those are the two things that you need to care about a changing climate. So instead, we have to confront the real problems. What are the real problems? The real problems are what we looked at the beginning, political polarization. The fact that the best predictor in the United States, and increasingly, sadly, in the UK and Canada as well, the best predictor of whether we agree with the science is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. And accompanying that is this idea that the impacts do not threaten us directly, but that the solutions do. The contrast here is stunning. 1 million Florida homes at risk due to climate change, but we're not going to destroy the economy to fix it. I don't want to return to the Stone Age. People even evoke language and messaging from the American Revolution. Government control, unfair taxation. But when you think about the solutions even more seriously, you realize to a certain extent, we've all bought into this, right? Because when I think about climate solutions, when I look at my personal carbon footprint, mine, you know where the biggest part of my footprint comes from? Travel. Flying is the #1 source of my carbon emissions. I live in Texas. If I want to go visit my family, who live in Toronto, I have to drive 6 hours to the nearest train station, which is in Oklahoma. Then I have to get on a train, and by the time that you, leaving from London, would be at the equivalent of Novosibirsk, I would be halfway to Toronto. So I fly. But what I do is I group my invitations and my presentations together. So I don't go somewhere for one reason. I go somewhere because I have multiple things in the same place. This is actually kind of a low volume trip. I'm only doing 4 public talks and a number of other informal meetings. Often in a couple of days I do as many as 8 or 9 talks, which is really exhausting, but hey, it really brings down the carbon footprint. And then I've transitioned about 75 to 80% of my talks to virtual. And often when I say, well, I can't come, even though I would love to, I mean, who doesn't want to go speak at a nature park in Norway? I would love to come, but I can't. Would you consider a virtual talk? And they say, well, we've never had one before. I say, well, you know, the topic of your meeting and workshop is the low carbon travel industry. So how about we actually give it a try? Well, I don't know. We have a really big screen. I don't think the resolution of, a Skype would be adequate. Okay, I'll go into a studio. I'll shoot it in 4K for you. I will learn how to edit the slides into the video. I can do that now. But it's worth it because, yes, it took about 8 hours to produce a half-hour video. I don't have a team. People often say, could somebody on your team do this? I'm like, what team? The team consists of me, myself, and I, with a little bit of help from somebody who helps me part-time with scheduling. But it's worth it because I'm able to talk about something in a way that actually means something. So let's be honest here. Be totally honest. When it comes to climate solutions, what are you, and again, this is anonymous, what are you genuinely worried about? Are you concerned that it would lead to overregulation, loss of personal freedom to make choices, reduced quality of life, the economy taking a hit, job loss for me, my family, or my friends, and this one's kind of a Texas joke. You would actually get a few responses on that one in Texas. In fact, I have literally had, thank you. I have literally had people say to me, everything you say makes sense, but I can't agree with you because if I agree with you, I have to agree with Al Gore, and I could never do that. That's the political polarization at work. So if we're honest, we actually really are concerned about the potential impacts of solutions on our lives. So the first most dangerous myth that we really have bought into is that I have to be a certain type of person to care, that actually the solutions might be worse for me if I'm being brutally honest. They might be worse for me. Sure, though, they might help people in Bangladesh or Africa, but they'd be worse for me, often we think very selfishly, of course. But the other myth that we really have bought into is this. This is from the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. I'm going to show you the US first, and then I will show you the UK. I don't have the UK as a map, so it's not as pretty. But you're not going to believe me, but trust me, I have the data to show you. We see the same thing, okay? So anything that is orange is greater than 50%, and the darker the color, the more people say yes. Is global warming happening? Pretty much almost the entire country is orange. There's a county in Utah. If you have really sharp eyes, there's one in West Virginia, just under the A of Washington, D.C. And then I think there's one right beside Atlanta as well. But everybody pretty much says global warming is happening. And when you ask them, do you think it will harm plants and animals? Everybody thinks it will, no matter whether they think it's happening or not. I know that's the problems with some public opinion polling. But you see the general picture. Will it harm future generations? Yes. Will it harm people in developing countries? You start to see a little bit of blue, but there's a lot less blue than when you actually ask, do you agree with the science? This is, do you agree that human activities are causing the problem? Do you think it will harm people in the United States? It's still mostly orange. And here comes the kicker. Do you think it will affect you? Now, if you're wondering about these orange counties, now you probably have a pretty educated guess. Who lives in South Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California? A lot of the most concerned people group about a changing climate. And then interestingly, up there in the Dakotas, people might say, well, what's happening there in the Dakotas? Well, if you map those counties onto where the proposed pipeline is, it maps quite closely. So there's been a lot of activism up there protesting the pipeline, and that might, I'm not sure, but it might account for some of those counties. So now let's look at the UK. I don't have pretty maps, but I do have the three key questions. Is climate change happening? Pretty much everybody says yes. Are humans responsible? Oh my gosh, we're down to 35%. Now, this is from the British Social Attitudes poll last year. I don't have 2019 data. Are you worried about it? About 25%. Why? Because the number one image of a changing climate is an animal that very few of us have actually seen in real life. But the interesting thing is that this is starting to change. This January, the Yale program that makes those maps saw the biggest jump they had ever seen in over 10 years of polling. And I bet if you did this in the UK, you would see a similar thing. And one of the reasons, when they asked me, I said, well, there's got to be multiple reasons. The 1.5 degree report is definitely one of them. The National Climate Assessment in the US is certainly another one. But for the first time, the birds are coming home to roost, so to speak. You don't have to go to the Arctic anymore to see the impacts of a changing climate. It's starting to happen in the places where we live, and this is affecting our opinion. So 20 years ago, when people asked you, why does climate change matter, a lot of people would have replied, the polar bear. But today, when we ask that question, we get a very different answer. So here's my question to you. When it comes to climate impacts, what are you most concerned about? If you're going to use multiple words, you do have to join in with a dash on this one. What are you most concerned about? You are allowed to answer the polar bear. That is an acceptable answer. But be truthful, be genuine. What are you actually most concerned about when it comes to a changing climate? Now, the first thing I notice here is there's no one word rising to the fore. Oh, food supply, it's got 2 votes. What do we see here? We're seeing a ton of different things, right? We're seeing biodiversity, which was reflected by the recent UN report that just came out, as well as by David Attenborough's documentary, which is amazing. And what do we have here? We have something that relates to everybody. We have poverty, children, destabilization of society, habitable land, conflict, starvation, glaciers, food and sex. I'm not quite sure what you meant by that, but sure, we'll go with that. Yep. I can see how that would definitely be a concern. Okay, so to be perfectly honest, I have never really seen such a diverse set of answers. This makes the point. We are starting to actually connect the dots between what we care about personally and how a changing climate affects it. So that leads us to the way forward. How do we move forward on this? And when you look at the polling data actually gives us an answer. So again, this is that dark blue, do you think global warming will harm you personally map, which looks horrible and is pretty much exactly the same for the UK, as we saw. But then they said, asking the same people, do you support funding research? Now, remember, funding research, who funds research? The government. How does the government fund research? Taxation. What is the dirtiest 3-letter word in the United States? TAX. Do you support funding research into renewable energy? Do you support tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels? Now, here's the crazy one. Do you support taxing fossil fuel companies? Did you know there's actually a bill before Congress in the US right now that was introduced in November, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, to put a price on carbon? It might have looked really, really socialist when they first introduced it, but now with the Green New Deal, it's moved to the middle. It's looking a lot more reasonable to people. So we realize that people actually are big fans of the real solutions, not the perceived solutions, destroying the economy and letting China, the United Nations, or the Antichrist rule the world. I have the emails to prove that that really is a theory. People are big fans of the real solutions. And then the polling data has one more insight to offer us, and that is that we thought this was the bluest map, but it wasn't. There's one more. And the dark bluest map that they have was this question. Do you ever talk about it? Look at that. So places where people say, oh, 100%, it is absolutely real, it is humans, even it's serious, they never talk about it. We've got Seattle, we've got San Francisco, and that's pretty much it. So when it comes to climate change, the biggest question I often get is, well, what can I do about it? I'm just one person. I don't make a difference. I could go carbon neutral, I could go carbon negative, and it would not influence the outcome of civilization on this planet. And then we build that up to the level of our country. We're just a little country. We can't make a difference in the world. Almost every Canadian I talk to has the number memorized. We're 2% of the world's emissions. People have that number memorized because we use it as a reason not to act. And so people say, well, what can I do that would make a difference? Because I've changed my light bulbs, I've switched to a mostly plant-based diet, I think more carefully about my flying and my travel, but I still feel helpless. And this actually, I think, is what gives us the answer. Because no matter who we are, no matter how old or how young or where we live, there's one thing that we all have in common. We have a voice. We might not be able to use our voice physically, but we have a way to express ourselves, just about all of us. And so those of us who are able to express ourselves can do what I believe is one of the most important things that anybody can do about climate change, that thing that really scares us, that thing that we're afraid will look like this, or that thing that we're really afraid will leave us looking like this. The most important thing we can do about a changing climate is, when they asked me to do a TED Talk last year, I said, this is what I want to do it on. Talking about it. Because, let me connect the dots here. You might say, talking about it? We're way past talking about it. Well, sure, I'm a climate scientist. I know just how far past we are. Every day, it seems, brings new news. The news from yesterday was a colleague emailing me his new paper where they found out that the increase in heavy precipitation extremes is accelerating. Great news. Not. I know how far past we are. And those of us who study paleoclimate know even further how past we are. Because when we look to the past, it looks even worse than it looks today. But if we don't talk about it, why would we care, right? And if we don't care, why would we act, and why would we demand that others act? So that's why it begins with a conversation. So let me ask you this. When it comes to climate change, who would you, one word or multiple words joined, you guys are getting good at this. When it comes to climate change, who would you most like to have a conversation with? A conversation that is constructive and positive, that does not end with anybody's head exploding or with you going catatonic in a corner. I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of people who have that name on their list. And if you can have a positive, constructive conversation with him, more power to you. I would applaud you all the way there. So, but again, look at the diversity here. I like the diversity. So you'd like to talk with your parents, with your kids, with Boris, with your family, with leaders, with school moms. I love that one. With people I previously let off the hook. With people who fly a lot, with Rex Tillerson, yes. With my employer, with my friends, with my family. Isn't this great? We want to have conversations with people. So how do we have these conversations? Well, I don't want to get into it too much because if you really want to know more about how to have the conversations, you can watch this. I'm not here to give you this. It already exists. But what I've learned is that to have a positive conversation, we have to do something which doesn't really make sense to us. We have to start with what we most agree on rather than what we most disagree on. And here's the thing. When do we feel like commenting on an article online? When do we feel like responding to a Facebook post if it's not of a cute baby or puppy or kitten? When do we feel like jumping into a conversation we hear? when we disagree. That's when we feel like jumping in. But that's the very wrong time to do it. To have a constructive conversation, we have to start with something we agree on. And if we don't know what that is, we have to talk about something else and figure out what is it that we can genuinely agree on. And then we can explain, connect the dots between why we would care about it based on our shared values. But we have to also talk about real, genuine, positive, practical solutions that empower people rather than leaving them, again, paralyzed and catatonic in the corner. I'm just going to give you one example from my TED Talk of how I did this. A number of years ago, I was asked to speak at our local Rotary Club for the first time. I'm not a Rotarian myself, but as I walked into the Rotary Club, I found that they had, let me see if I have a picture of this. I found that they had, oops, I've lost my mouse, here we go. They had conveniently printed their values on a giant 4-foot banner. The 4-way test. So I looked at this and I thought to myself, wow, is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? Absolutely not. That's why I care so much about a changing climate, because it is profoundly unfair. Would it build goodwill or better friendships to fix it? It would. Would it be beneficial? Well, it depends. If you fix it, yes. If not, no. So I took my presentation, which had previously focused on climate impacts in West Texas, to identify, to focus on our shared geography, and I rearranged it quickly into the 4-way test. And then I gave the 4-way test on climate change to this group of conservative West Texas business people. And I will never forget, first of all, it all kind of started out like this, with everybody giving the woman who invited me kind of the side eye. You could see it. She was over there trying to pretend she didn't. Then, as I started to go through the 4-way test, you could kind of see a little bit like this. And then by the end, people were like, aha. And at the end, I will never forget, a local bank owner came up to me with the most bemused look on his face I've ever seen. And he said, I never thought too much about this whole global warming thing, but it passed the 4-way test. Like, what can I do? So why did that work? It worked because we started with his values. And I esteemed his values, because I absolutely do esteem this. I think this is a great 4-way test. And in his value system, I connected the dots between how climate change matters and how, if he was a Rotarian who took the 4-way test seriously, he was the perfect person to care about a changing climate. In fact, caring about and acting on a changing climate made him an even better Rotarian than he already was. That is the key. So when we talk about the impacts, we have to make it personal. We have to bring it down to where people live, how they're being affected personally, in ways that they can see it with their eyes, things that we recognize in the places where we live. But we also have to talk about solutions. And that's where I think the biggest impact of what we do ourselves comes in. Yes, I changed even the weird-looking light bulbs, and it was hard to find, but here's the best ones I found. We don't have curbside recycling where I live, but the university recycles, and it supports 35 student scholarships through the proceeds. So when you tell people that, everybody wants to bag up their garbage and take it to the university to support students. Eating lower down the food chain matters. Shopping local, we do have a farmer's market where I live. Looking at large purchases and making them more efficient. For Christmas this year, my husband was spending a lot of time on the phone, and I got very suspicious. Then he asked for my social security number, and I was like, oh, Lord, what is happening? He wouldn't tell me what it was. I was like, I love my plug-in car. Do not dare buy me another car. I would actually not want another car. He's like, no, it's not that. And so when we arrived home for Christmas, because we were away at families, I arrived home to this. Yes. And the best part of it is that he bought these from a local company. It's based in San Antonio, Texas, called Mission Solar. That last time oil prices tanked, they took in out-of-work oil patch workers who had lost their jobs and retrained them in a permanent position as solar panel manufacturers. So it was a win-win-win, really. I love talking about what communities are doing in unexpected ways. What some of the richest companies in the world are doing. Walmart's number 1, Apple's number 11. I like talking about what Texas is doing because you would never guess that Texas has, well, you would guess that Texas has the biggest army base in the US, right? You would guess that. But did you know it's powered by wind and solar energy? Because they're saving $150 million by doing so? Did you know that the Dallas-Fort Worth airport is the first carbon neutral airport in North America? Did you know that the city of Dallas is already 100% carbon neutral in all of its operations? I didn't even know that until February. We also have entire towns that are powering the whole town by going green. And it's really cool to talk about what's happening in the places where we live. The first coal-free day, every year they update this headline, right? I should update it myself too. Every year they update it with a new number of hours that Britain has gone without coal. A whole week, thank you, exactly. I will definitely update it now. In Canada, I love, this turned out a bit weird, I love the fact that the 4 provinces that economically outperformed all the rest of them all had a price on carbon. That's some pretty cool news. When you look at headlines in the States, you see all kinds of political headlines. The new climate plan. Washington State commits to 100% clean energy. When you look at what's going on here, climate emergency. So people are talking about it, and they're giving us all kinds of talking points to use when we talk about it. And I love talking about unexpected solutions that we might not be thinking about. Solutions like Project Drawdown talks about biochar. The idea that you burn agricultural residue at high temperature, it traps the carbon in this kind of gray powder, you plow it back into the soil like they've been doing in the Amazon for hundreds of years, and it's like Miracle Grow on steroids, trapping the carbon in the soil where we want it. Clean cook stove programs that cut millions of deaths in air pollution at the same time as keeping carbon in the ecosystem. Education of women and girls in developing countries is number 6. And number 3, food waste. So when we talk about climate change, we need to understand how bad it is. We can't sugarcoat it. It is not the end of the planet. It is the potential end of human civilization as we know it. That is what is at stake. But we have to, at the same time, show people what we can do to fix it, because without solutions, without hope, we'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy of despair. So my last question to you is this. What gives you hope? Where do you find hope? If you don't know how to answer, yeah, I love that. If you don't know how to answer, don't answer. Just look at the other answers and think about what might give you hope. I love that I'm seeing some of the young people, young generation, Greta children coming out, because one thing that people say is, well, to fix climate change, we have to stop having children. But if we stop having children, where's our hope? I mean, we've definitely, we've gotten to the point where we have been fruitful and multiplied and filled the earth, accomplished, check mark. But at the same time, our children are our hope. Not our individual children either, but all of them. Now, the Thanos is an interesting one. I'm actually going to do an interview on Monday talking about, well, what happened if the people didn't come back? In the Avengers movie, that's what the Thanos is about. I've been thinking about that ever since I watched the movie. Half the Earth's population was wiped out, but then they brought them back suddenly a number of years later. What impact would that have on climate change? So what does this have in common? What is this all about? People. This is about people. The science is not what gives me hope. In fact, the science gets more depressing with every new study that comes out. What gives me hope is people. And how do we engage with each other, with people? By talking to each other, by communicating with each other, respectfully, constructively, positively, realistically, focusing on what we have in common. So how do we talk about climate? By bonding over the values that we share, by explaining what we need to know, but most of all, by finding ways that we can work together to act. So how to change the climate dialogue? It turned out that Jane Goodall, one of my favorite scientists, had the answer all along. A number of years ago, she said, it's only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential. Thank you.
So do you want to use the computer, for the phone to do the questions?
Yeah. So there are two ways to do questions. The first is you can type in your full question here, it will appear, and you can upvote the ones you want us to talk about. But we're also going to do it the old-fashioned way also, because not everybody has a phone or a laptop. So what we'll do is we'll maybe take
the two first questions we'll take from the floor, and then we'll go to the questions on there. So
yes. Hands
up if you have a question. And we're going to start right at the back. And I should have told you all this at the start. This is all being live streamed. So if you're going to ask a question, it's going to be broadcast to the world.
Yes.
What I'd like you to do is to start by saying what your name is, any affiliation you want to declare, and questions are particularly welcome rather than long speeches from the floor.
Yes.
So hands up again if you want to ask a question. I'm going to start with the young woman at the back, second from the back.
Excellent. And then also, if you're typing in your question, remember to keep it a bit short because it's going to cut you off if you go too long. And if you are listening online on the live stream, you can also participate in entering or upvoting the questions.
Very good. Okay.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk.
What's your name?
My name's Raymat. I've just finished a postdoc at the University of Bristol, and now I'm back London-based and job hunting. I've done a lot of Skype a Scientist things with US classes, and it's crazy how variable the questions get between states. But I was just wondering, like, if like a 10-year-old can be a climate skeptic in one state but not in another, what's generally behind that?
Oh, I can tell you, their parents' opinions. That's the number one. But there was a fascinating study that just came out last week that was conducted in North Carolina, which is quite a conservative part of the country. And what they did was they provided climate change educational materials to students, and then they measured not the opinion of the students, the opinion of their parents, to see if it changed when their child was exposed to accurate information on climate change. And what they found was that there was a statistically significant change in the parents' opinions. And in fact, the strongest change, which I absolutely love, was when young daughters spoke to their conservative fathers. That was where the biggest change happened.
Very good. Okay, hands up again, and we'll take the gentleman with the glasses next to Ginny. Can you wait for the microphone, yeah, and say who you are and your any affiliation?
Jonathan Waxman. Thank you for the talk. It was excellent. I'm worried about polarization in the debate that some people are suggesting, particularly Extinction Rebellion, that we need structural change and current systems are insufficient to address climate change. Given the scope of action so broad that we require, what do you think about that? How do we keep everyone engaged on the right, the middle and the left, and not allow this to become dominated by one wing of politics or the other?
Yes, that is a really tough question. And I have to say that that type of question is exactly what illustrates why we need all of us involved in this. Sometimes I feel like people suffer from the one-stop shop syndrome where they think, oh, if you study climate change, then you must be able to address all of these issues. You probably get that a lot, Bob. But we need all of us, all of our voices and all of our perspectives raised. So what I would say is, I would say that climate change is real, it is us, the impacts are serious, and we need to fix that, and we can agree on that. But we will never agree on a single policy because we all come from across the spectrum. But I think that the dialogue has been incredibly helpful because the greater diversity of ideas we bring to the table, the more robust solutions hopefully we'll ultimately end up with. And also, interestingly, speaking more to what's happening on the other side, interestingly, when, for example, the Green New Deal came out, then that actually made other policies look more moderate and conservative in comparison. So by broadening the spectrum of concern, engagement, and solutions, we're actually, I feel, really highlighting solutions that are more bipartisan, that are more moderate, that are more centrist, whereas before, because this is such a strongly politicized issue, you even just use the word climate and change, and you can automatically be labeled, as a socialist or a liberal. So I think that broadening the discussion is really helpful because we have to explore all ends of the spectrum in order to actually be able to come to convergence. But I would say that one thing that frustrates me is when people say, we have to fix X first and then we can fix climate change. we have to fix capitalism first. In the United States, they talk a lot about how they have to remove Citizens United that gave corporations the rights of a person. People say we have to get everybody in line with the science. We have to fix the educational system first. And as a scientist, I can definitely say we don't have time for that. We have to fix it with the broken, flawed, incomplete system we have today. Whatever we can do that works, we have to do it, because otherwise we might, and probably will, run out of time. So that's why, again, we need all of our voices from across the political spectrum engaged on the solutions.
Very good. Okay, I think we'll take the first question now. The only challenge is that you didn't respond to Katharine's plea that you make it short enough that we can read it. So there's somebody who voted for or gave that first question who can read out the full question from the floor. So somebody who's done that? Maybe the gentleman. Please wait for the microphone to come.
That would be helpful.
So if you can read out the full, and I'm assuming it does end with a question mark.
It's not an essay. The full question is, I perceive big UK changes in perception recently, and I think it's a combination of David Attenborough, the Greta-related child-led school strikes and Extinction Rebellion, but how can we get the media to increase their coverage? Almost no mention on the BBC on a daily basis, for example.
No, that isn't true, yeah. Well, the whole second row already, no.
Yeah, I know.
Let me actually point you to a resource. So there's a researcher called Max Boykoff, B-O-Y-K-O-F-F, at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who tracks media coverage of climate change around the world by country and by outlet. And he has actually tracked a significant spike in media coverage and attention. And it's really fascinating because we're starting to see it show up a lot of places with one big exception. The one major exception where we are not seeing increased media coverage is with the 24-hour news stations. And what's really fascinating is, we got some insight into that when I try to do all the interviews I can because I think it's so important to talk about this as much as we can. But the one person who has canceled on me multiple times, once when I was in the studio with the thing in my ear, on a Saturday with my child sitting beside me who I dragged away from a play date to go into the studio, another time when I was on my way there, another time when I was halfway. The one person who's canceled on me multiple times in a row was Chris Hayes, who does All In with Chris Hayes on MSNBC. And so somebody said something to me about, you should do something on Chris Hayes. And I said, well, I would love to, but I can't anymore because he just cancels on me. So he joined in the discussion, thanks to the democracy of Twitter. And he said, well, to be perfectly honest, talking about climate change is a ratings killer. So interestingly, there's a difference between the 24-hour news programs, which unfortunately dominate so much of our conversation today, and other coverage such as by the BBC, the CBC, the Guardian, even the Independent, even the Washington Post, even the Financial Times. We are starting to see the discussion spread, thanks in part to what you said above, as well as to the 1.5 degree report. In the US, the National Climate Assessment got a ton of press. It got even more press because the administration tried to suppress it, which always makes for a double better story. And also because of the increasingly supercharged disasters that we are seeing around the world, that the science of attribution has advanced to the point where we're starting to be able to put numbers on the percentage of rainfall that fell during Hurricane Harvey that would not have occurred if the same storm had happened 100 years ago when the planet was not as warm. So there's a lot coming together that is driving this. But again, we need to talk about it. We need more conversation about it. And so one of the things that I'm most excited about is this past month, I was asked to serve as the guest editor for Canada's largest women's magazine. And I said yes in a heartbeat, because the people who read Chatelaine magazine are people who are not going to pick up, Mother Earth or Green Living. So it was crazy. I mean, that is intense to guest edit. We looked at the fashion, the makeup, the recipes, but they had articles on our health, on women entrepreneurs in the clean energy industry. I wrote an essay on having those difficult conversations. And what I loved is, this is the first comment we got back on the issue, and I want to read this comment if you don't mind, and then we'll go on to the next question. what I tried to do is I tried to instill that rational hope, the awareness of how bad it is, but the empowering recognition and realization of what we can do. And the very first comment we got back was this one. I just received my new issue of Chatelaine, and I have read it cover to cover. It's the best issue ever. The handling of global warming and its very real and imminent threats, balanced by practical, actual things readers can do, is wonderful. After reading it, I'm not sunk in depression. Rather, I feel enlightened and empowered. I cannot thank you enough.
Is that good?
I think it is. I think it is. Because if she feels, now, the contrast she used was sunk in depression. So I don't know if you've ever been depressed, but when you're depressed, most of us, we sink into inaction. We sink into a feeling of there's nothing we can do. I can't make a difference. It's too much. Depression is going to, apathy is going to, paralyzation by fear is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have to have not irrational hope, not Pollyanna hope, not somehow it's not so bad hope. We have to have fully informed, rational hope if we're going to fix this thing. That's what I truly, truly believe. And we can agree to disagree on that, but I'm pretty convinced.
Very good. Okay, let's take another question from the survey. So the next one up is, what do you think of Extinction Rebellion's strategy of focusing on the threat of extinction?
I think it works great for people who care about extinction.
Shall we do a quick show of hands? Who here cares about extinction?
There we go.
Most of us.
We're a bit of a self-selected audience, though. So, for those of us who care about extinction, it connects the dots between something that we feel very passionate and strongly about and a changing climate. The best description of climate change that I've ever heard comes from the US military, who calls it a threat multiplier. We don't care about climate change intrinsically because the idea of a 1.5 degree increase in the average temperature of the entire planet keeps me up at night. It's because that 1.5 or 2 degree, or heaven forbid 3 or 4 degree change affects everything I already care about. It affects the amazing, incredible animals that make my identity as a Canadian what it is. It affects the health and the prosperity of my family. It affects the economy. It affects jobs of people I know. It affects the well-being of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world who already suffer from poverty and hunger today. I care about climate change because it directly connects with what I already care about. So my answer might have sounded flippant, but it really wasn't. It works great when we care about extinction, but we have to realize not everybody does. And so Anthony and I were actually talking about this earlier. We did a little YouTube episode together that talked specifically about this. When we first talk about climate change with people, we assume they already care because of what we care about. Then we realize, oh, they don't have the same values as I do. So then stage 2 in our communication is, I need to somehow instill the correct values into them. Well, you know, you can smell somebody a mile away when they think you haven't got the right values and you need to be educated. Mostly those people might, be coming to your door with a little name tag and you tend to run out the back when you see them coming. So stage 3 is when we realize that just about every single person on the planet just about really does have the values they need to care about climate change. We just have to spend the time figuring out what those are and then connecting the dots. Because even if somebody is a libertarian in the United States, they should be, if they really are a libertarian, absolutely outraged that somebody else's decisions are affecting their property. Because that's the definition of a libertarian. So what we have to do is we have to figure out what people already care passionately about, and the joy and wonder of nature really is something that Sir David Attenborough has exploited fully. I mean, and that's a bad word, not exploited, but used effectively, because we do care about that tremendously. But there's other things too, and we have to connect the dots to every single one of those things, because who we already are is the perfect person to care.
Very good. Okay, we'll take one more from here, and then we'll come back to the floor for a couple. So, how do you talk about changing behavior, such as diet and travel, without putting people off?
Oh, this is a really hard one, because I'm going to be totally honest. I have to try not to be put off myself by the way people talk to me. It's really tough. Nowadays, I know, if I say I'm in the UK, the first comment I get is, how do you think you're getting there? I'm like, well, actually, I'm taking a freighter that runs on green energy. Just kidding. I wish I could. Maybe one day I will. When I say something about how I live in Texas, people are like, oh, are you a vegan? No, I'm not. I buy meat from our university, which practices sustainable grazing practices, but I think it's actually really important to show people in my area that I believe in them and I understand when they're actually trying to, like some of my colleagues are, investigate how sustainable grazing puts carbon back in the soil or how feeding cows seaweed cuts their methane emissions, that I support them in that work. That doesn't mean I'm going to eat a steak for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it does mean that I am going to talk about things that people might not like. How do we talk about things without turning people off? The number one way is to not wave the bony finger of judgment. It is a very, very unpleasant thing to be judging people, to be saying, well, I've reached the pinnacle. You have not. Let me tell you how if you wanted to reach the pinnacle, you could. Here is the new list of 10 green 10 commandments that you must do. It's the most off-putting thing in the world. Judging other people, basically putting them down, holding ourselves up on a pedestal, that's completely counterproductive. So when I was asked a few years ago to come speak to address the board of an oil and gas company, I had to sit down and think to myself, what am I going to say? Because if I don't know where to start the conversation, I shouldn't be having it. If we can't find a point of agreement, we should not be having that conversation. We are not the right person to have that conversation with that person. So I sat down and I thought to myself, what is my point of connection? And I realized that I am genuinely and profoundly grateful for the benefits that fossil fuels have brought us. The life of endless drudgery that was a woman's lot 300 or 400 years ago, I've been saved from that. The fact that the medical advances that were made thanks to the Industrial Revolution powered by fossil fuels mean that I'm alive today and I probably would have been dead by my age. I appreciate having electricity. I love being able to travel and meet and see new people. Fossil fuels have truly brought us tremendous benefits, and the people who have done that work, I mean, the work of a coal miner, the work of somebody out in the oil fields, it is a tough, hard job. So I went in and I started by expressing my gratitude and my appreciation for the energy that they brought the world, for the fact that the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom has doubled our average lifespan from 40 to 80 years. If you're like me over the age of 40, think about it. We'd have a 50-50 chance of being dead by now. And the fact that people need energy. The answer is not to pull the plug today because that would actually cause more suffering. So when I started talking, there was a lot of very surprised faces because they were not expecting climate scientists to start on that. But then after that, when they realized that I understood that they view what they do as a service to humanity, and it really truly has been, we had the most amazing productive conversation that went double overtime on how do we know climate is changing, humans are responsible, and what we can do to actually fix it, because they know energy, we need energy. How are we going to transition to a carbon-free economy? It was the most positive conversation that I've ever had.
Very good. Okay, let's take a couple more from the floor. There's a young woman in the third row from the back in the middle. Please wait for the microphone and tell us your name.
My name's Emily. I'm a student of geography here at the LSE. So recently there's definitely been a lot of like a consumerist move towards environment. So a lot of places in the UK, such as like McDonald's, Wetherspoons, are no longer doing plastic straws, for example, which is no doubt something very positive. But do you think that these small changes, like the consumerist changes, are distracting us from the bigger issues? You know, people might think that, you know, you're saving the planet, and you no doubt it's having a positive impact using less plastic and all that sort of thing. But do you think it's distracting us essentially from the bigger issues that we have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is yes and no. Because part of it is we feel like, you know, the world's ocean's been contaminated by plastic. I think the most recent headline was the deepest sea dive found a plastic bag down there. We feel like I'm just one person, what can I do? But then we see, oh, even if I eat at McDonald's, I don't have a plastic straw anymore. I'm part of the solution. It makes us feel empowered, like we can actually be part of the solution. But the opposite end of the spectrum, of course, is me feeling like, oh, well, I've done my part. So it's a fine balance, and this is where the social sciences come into play. It's a fine balance between empowering people, making them recognize that this really does make a difference. In my opinion, a bigger difference is Burger King offering a Beyond Meat burger. That's actually huge, that people can actually try something out at a Burger King that is not real meat but tastes like meat, because I ordinarily have to go to one of those, weird health food stores to get that. No, we even have those in Texas, and they're great. So there is definitely the aspect of making it tangible and personal and real, but then at the same time providing the next step and the next step and the next step, so we don't think that we've reached Mount Everest when we arrive at the first base camp. Now, if you don't mind, Bob, I'd like to take one that I saw but that passed down.
Yeah. Sure?
Oh,
Which
number
one?
2 is really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, number 2 is really good.
Why don't you go for that one then? Why is the
Okay.
environmental sector so white?
Well, there's actually 2 things in there. You might not recognize it. The first is the word environmental, and the second is the word right. So one of the greatest challenges, I think, that we've had is that climate change has been pigeonholed as an environmental issue. So if I am already an environmentalist, then of course I care about climate change. But if I'm not an environmentalist, which many people would not say they are, then I don't. Now, is climate change an environmental issue? Of course. But is it only an environmental issue? Absolutely not. Climate change is today already an economic issue. Climate change is a humanitarian issue. It exacerbates, again, poverty and hunger and disease and political instability and even refugee crises. Climate change is an ecological issue. Climate change is a food issue. It's an energy issue. It's a national security issue. So by pigeonholing climate change as only an environmental issue, again, it's the same thing with the Extinction Rebellion. With extinction, people who care about environment then care about it, but people who don't. Then the second part of the question. When you look at a map of cumulative carbon emissions, have you ever seen a map of that? I actually have one, but I don't think I have it in this presentation. Then you look at a map of who is most affected by a changing climate. I'll post those 2 maps on my Twitter account later today if you're interested. They are exactly the opposite. They are the mirror image of each other. The people who produce the greatest emissions are the people who bear the least consequences of those choices and those decisions. And that is profoundly unfair. And so the reason why I do what I do, the reason why when people say, well, what's the biggest thing that you've done to fix climate change? It has nothing to do with light bulbs or solar panels or what I eat. It's the fact that I switched my entire career from astrophysics to climate change because I felt like I took a class by accident. That's actually what happened. I took a class, not totally by accident. I mean, I picked it, but I had to finish my degree. I needed an extra course. I'd already finished, a minor in Spanish, and I'd taken children's literature, which destroyed all joy in children's literature for the rest of my life. I've discovered I hate analyzing literature. I just want to read it. And there's a course over in the geography department that was on climate change, and I thought to myself, well, this looks interesting. I mean, growing up in Canada with a science teacher dad, I knew that the grass was green, the sky was blue, and climate was changing due to human activities. But I figured, I should learn more about these environmental issues. So I took this class, and I was absolutely stunned to realize, first of all, that climate science was the exact same physics I'd been learning in astrophysics. I mean, it's just a special case of planetary atmospheres. I don't know what I thought it was, but that's what it is. And then the second thing was that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a humanitarian issue. When I was 9 years old, my family picked up and moved to Colombia, South America. So growing up with friends who live in homes that are built of bamboo or cardboard boxes from old Tide containers, visiting towns and villages where landslides have wiped away the homes of 20,000 people and the military police are basically there to pick up the bodies. I mean, when you've seen this stuff yourself at a young age, as a young child, and you recognize how vulnerable we are to already natural disasters, and then you recognize that climate change is exacerbating these disasters, as well as affecting food supply, water supply, security, and more, I thought to myself, how can I not, serendipitously having these skills, study this most important issue that we have? And now, not only do I do my research, I am a regular professor, I teach, I do research, I publish, I write those blasted grants, not to pay myself, to pay my students. In addition to that, I've tried to rearrange my schedule such that I can spend about a third of my time talking about it to people, because talking about it is so important. But again, when we talk about it, we have to do it effectively, and we have to have those conversations where we meet in the middle, and we have to have conversations that recognize that it's not all about us. When you go to Paris, when you go to the COP meetings, when you go to Poland, it isn't a bunch of white people just talking about mitigation. It is a ton of people from around the world saying, we are already suffering today. How can you help? And when I first went to my first COP meeting, when I got home from that meeting, I was so angry at the injustice that I saw of all these, smug countries, wealthy countries sitting there saying, oh, well, no, we can't reduce emissions that much. That would just cost too much. When there was over 100 countries there, just simply there to say, we didn't cause the problem. We don't hardly produce any emissions, but we are suffering. What can you do? I couldn't have a conversation with anyone for several weeks after that because I was afraid I would literally grab them by the lapels and start shaking them and screaming in their face. So that actually relates to the question I wanted to answer that isn't here. And somebody asked, do we think, is social media increasing our polarization? I just read a really interesting book by James Hogan, a Canadian PR expert. It's called I'm Right and You're an Idiot. I highly recommend it. In fact, as I was reading it, I was actually reading bits out to my husband. He's like, oh, I have to read it too. I'm right and you're an idiot. He interviews, every chapter is another top thinker in the area of human psychology, sociology, communication, PR, and how it relates to not just climate change, but all the politically polarized issues of today. They do spend a lot of time talking about climate change. And what was fascinating was he talked to a researcher she was watching videos on YouTube of Trump rallies, and she found that after she was watching these videos for research purposes, YouTube would be recommending far-right videos to her about, KKK rallies and racism and things like that. So she thought, that's an interesting algorithm. So then she started watching Bernie Sanders speeches. And you know what she got recommended to her? Far left conspiracy theories. Yeah, there are those too. GMOs, chemtrails, other things like that. So then she started watching all these different topics, and she found out that YouTube's algorithm, and she published this, I forget her name, but it's in Jim's book. Sorry? Was it? Okay, there we go. And she found out that YouTube's algorithm actually radicalizes every single one of us, no matter what we look for, because they found that it's clickbait. More people watch it, the more tantalizing it is. And then, of course, Facebook. Oh, you know about Facebook. So last summer, Facebook decided that any post that contained the words clean or renewable or solar or wind energy was political. So on my page, which is clearly marked as a scientist page, I could no longer boost any global weirding episode, which I boost specifically to reach the friends and family of people who like my page, because on Facebook, people tend to be a bit more conservative than on Twitter. I could no longer boost anything that had clean energy in it. I complained. They said, oh, you just have to get certified as a political entity. I said, no, thank you. I refuse. I had a few people say, oh, I'll help you with it. It's not a big deal. I said, no. I am not going to be certified as a political entity. And then you know what happened a couple of months later? Global warming and climate change added the list. So Facebook has caused them to be political such that you can only boost posts if you're a political entity, and people are using that very effectively to, of course, boost posts about misinformation about climate change. But at the same time, I think that social media can be very democratizing. Not at the far ends of the echo chamber. I feel very strongly that, for example, on Twitter, if somebody comes at you with just full disrespect, treating you as a subhuman being, which unfortunately happens quite a bit, there is not going to be a constructive conversation to be had. I will often give people 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 chances, but as soon as it's very clear that nothing I say is in any way getting any further than 1 inch away from their eardrums, there's just no point. But truly dismissive people, even in the US, are only 9% of the population. So that means that there's 91% in the US, probably in the UK, I don't know the numbers, might be 94, 95%, who are open and who appreciate hearing information and who we can interact with about things that matter. And so my very, very, very favorite comment ever that I got on Twitter was from somebody who comes from a very conservative part of Canada, somebody who is very conservative theologically, somebody who has been very connected with the oil and gas industry, but he lurked. He lurked for quite a while, because social media is great for lurking, right? Not talking about stalking, that's different, I do not endorse that, just lurking. And after a while of lurking, he sent me the best message ever. He said, I just wanted to let you know that your winsome approach has dragged my sorry denier's ass to the truth. And I would never have called him a denier. I think that's a very polarizing word. But I think that social media is a tool that can be used for good or for evil. I think that some of the algorithms that Facebook and YouTube use are using it for evil. But when I think about quitting, which I frequently do, I think about the positive things that have happened if we can use a tool for good. And so that is my intent and my purpose, because otherwise, why would we let people own it who aren't using it for good?
Well, I think with the final message being use social media for good, not evil.
Yes.
We will round it up for today. We could go on all afternoon, but unfortunately we're at 2:00. So please join me in thanking Katharine for an absolutely outstanding. And in addition to Global Weirding on YouTube, and even if she's not a certified political entity,
Right.
Also follow her on Twitter at Hayhoe, and anywhere else you see her, follow everything. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Katharine. That was really great, really great. I'll be interested when you finish.
Thing that'll be uploaded, so that's live streamed straight to YouTube, so there'll be a video of everything that just happened on there. No worries. Yeah, if you want to find out